Did he admit to you that he murdered his family?
He absolutely did.
Say anything about getting married?
To me?
Yeah.
I mean, it was like a thing where it was like offhandedly, like one day maybe this will happen. But again, it was like these were, I did not take these as very like deep conversations. It wasn't like this is when we're going to get married, this is what's going to go on.
The room had gone completely silent. Christopher Watts had just failed the polygraph test. And now, investigators were watching him unravel in real time. 2 little girls were missing. A pregnant mother had vanished. And the man sitting across from detectives was still pretending to be the worried husband. But what nobody in that interrogation room fully understood yet was that Christopher Watts had already told so many lies. Even his confessions couldn't be trusted. Over the next few hours, investigators would uncover a story so disturbing. A husband smiling during interviews, a family that looked perfect online, and a quiet suburban home in Frederick, Colorado, that was hiding something horrifying. But the deeper detectives looked into Christopher Watts, the stranger the story became. Because even today, people still debate what really happened inside that house on Sherrod.
You think she just took off? Do you think?
I mean, right now I don't even want to just like throw anything out there. Like, I hope that she's somewhere safe right now and with the kids. But I mean, could she just taken off? I don't know. But if somebody has her and they're not safe, like, I want them back now. Like that's what's in my head. Like, if they're safe right now, they're gonna come back. But if they're not safe right now, that's the not knowing part. Like, if they're not safe, last night I had every light in the house on. I was hoping that I would just ran over by the kids running in the door and just like barrel rushing me, but it didn't happen. And it was just a traumatic night trying to be here.
Welcome to Midnight Evidence. In today's case, we will be looking into Christopher Watts and the lies he told. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel, and now, let us get into it. Before the headlines, before the interrogations, and before America knew the name Christopher Watts, there was a family that seemed almost perfect. In the quiet town of Frederick, Colorado, Christopher Watts lived with his wife, Shanann Watts, and their 2 daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, known to family and friends as Cece. Their home sat at 2825 Saratoga Trail, in a peaceful suburban neighborhood about 30 miles north of Denver. To outsiders, the Watts family looked happy. Shanann Watts documented much of their lives online. Birthday parties, family vacations, pregnancy updates, live streams from inside the house. Her Facebook page painted the picture of a loving husband, a growing family, and the kind of life many people dream about. Christopher Watts was often described as quiet, calm, and reserved. Friends later said he rarely showed strong emotions. He appeared soft-spoken, polite, almost invisible at times. Shanann, on the other hand, was energetic, outspoken, and highly active on social media. Together, they appeared balanced. But appearances can hide a lot. Behind the Facebook smiles, the Watts family was struggling financially. In 2015, Chris and Shanann filed for bankruptcy. Reports later revealed mounting credit card debt, unpaid bills, and growing financial pressure inside the home. But online, almost none of that was visible. The image of the perfect family continued. And then, in 2018, Shanann announced something that seemed like a fresh start. She was pregnant again. The couple planned to name the baby boy Nico. To followers online, the announcement looked joyful. But investigators would later uncover messages suggesting the marriage was already collapsing beneath the surface. By the summer of 2018, something inside Christopher Watts had changed. And while Shanann was trying to save her marriage, Chris Watts was beginning to imagine life without his family. In June of 2018, Christopher Watts met a woman named Nicole Kessinger. And according to investigators, that meeting would change everything. By the summer of 2018, the cracks inside the Watts marriage were becoming impossible to ignore. And while Shanann Watts believed the distance between them could still be repaired, Christopher Watts had already started living a second life. In June of 2018, Chris met a woman named Nicole Kessinger while working at Anadarko Petroleum in Colorado. Nicole was an environmental contractor working near Chris. According to investigators, the relationship between them became serious very quickly. And almost immediately, people around Chris began noticing changes in him. The quiet, reserved husband suddenly became different. He started exercising more, losing weight, changing the way he dressed. For the first time in years, Christopher Watts appeared excited about something. But while Chris was growing closer to Nicole Kessinger, Shanann Watts was over 1,500 miles away in North Carolina with Bella and Cece. On June 27, 2018, Shanann traveled with the children to visit family in Aberdeen, North Carolina. The trip was supposed to help the family reconnect. Instead, it created even more distance. During those 6 weeks apart, Chris spent more and more time with Nicole. Investigators later discovered dinner dates, secret outings, romantic messages, and online searches connected to their relationship. At the same time, Shanann's text messages painted a very different picture. She told friends Chris had become emotionally cold. He barely called, barely texted, and sometimes sounded completely detached from the marriage. In one message, Shanann admitted she felt like she no longer knew her husband. And as the weeks passed, her fear only grew stronger. But Chris Watts kept lying. He told Shanann he loved her. He told Nicole he was near separation. Before we continue, do not forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from, because this story just got hotter. By August of 2018, Shanann had returned to Colorado. And behind closed doors, the marriage was beginning to collapse completely. Then, on August 9th, Shanann boarded a flight to Scottsdale, Arizona for a business trip. What she didn't know was that she was about to spend the final weekend of her life trying to save a marriage that Chris Watts had already emotionally abandoned. By August 9, 2018, everything inside the Watts marriage was moving too fast to stop. Shanann Watts had just left for Scottsdale, Arizona, attending a Thrive business trip she believed would help stabilize her future. But back in Frederick, Colorado, Christopher Watts was no longer playing the role of a distant husband. He was actively planning an escape from the life he no longer wanted. Text messages recovered by investigators showed Shanann trying to reconnect, asking questions, trying to understand why Chris felt so distant. But his responses were short, detached, and behind those messages, Chris Watts was spending time with Nicole Kessinger. According to investigators, the relationship had accelerated far beyond what either of them initially admitted. Plans were already being discussed about separation, divorce, and a completely different future. But that future required one thing: Shanann Watts out of the picture. On August 12, 2018, Shanann returned home from Arizona late at night. She was pregnant, exhausted, and unaware that she was walking back into a marriage that had already collapsed. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's home captured her arrival at approximately 1:48 a.m. She walked into 2825 Saratoga Trail for the last time. Inside the house that night, something happened that would change everything. But what investigators would later discover is that Chris Watts' version of that night would never stay the same. Because every time he told the story, it changed. And each version raised more questions than answers. The truth, however, was about to come out in the most unexpected way. On the morning of August 13, 2018, Shanann Watts was reported missing. And within hours, Frederick Police Department officers were standing at the door of the Watts home, knocking on a story that was already beginning to fall apart. And what they saw inside that house would make them immediately suspicious of the man who answered the door: Chris Watts. On the morning of August 13, 2018, the quiet neighborhood of Frederick, Colorado, woke up to a disappearance that made no sense. A pregnant woman was missing. 2 young children were missing. And inside 2825 Saratoga Trail stood the last person who had seen them: Christopher Watts. It started with a phone call. At approximately midday, Shanann Watts failed to show up for a scheduled doctor's appointment. Her friend, Nicole Atkinson, who had dropped her off the night before after the Arizona trip, became worried almost immediately. Shanann was pregnant, 15 weeks along, and it was completely out of character for her to disappear without contact. Nicole tried calling and texting repeatedly. No response. She then drove to the Watts residence in Frederick, Colorado, and what she found made her fear the worst. Shanann's car was in the driveway. But something felt wrong. She contacted police. And within minutes, officers from the Frederick Police Department arrived at 2825 Saratoga Trail. Bodycam footage would later show Christopher Watts answering the door calmly. Too calmly. Inside the house, investigators noticed immediate inconsistencies. Shanann's phone was found inside the home. Her purse was still there. But Chris Watts told officers something didn't add up. He said he didn't know where his wife and children were, and that they had simply vanished. As officers moved through the house, the atmosphere shifted. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, and no clear explanation. But what investigators did notice was Chris Watts himself. His behavior did not match the urgency of a missing family. He was calm, cooperative, controlled, almost rehearsed. As the investigation expanded, detectives began learning more about the Watts family history. They learned Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant. They learned the couple had recently been in financial trouble. And they learned Chris Watts had recently been acting differently. But the most important discovery was still ahead. Because while police were treating this as a missing persons case, they were already beginning to suspect that something far more disturbing had taken place inside that house. And by the end of the day, Christopher Watts would no longer just be a concerned husband. He would become the center of a murder investigation. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Because what happens next changes everything investigators thought they knew about this case. By the evening of August 14, 2018, the disappearance of Shanann Watts and her two daughters had now become a full-scale public crisis. But what was about to unfold next would push the investigation into an entirely new direction. Because Christopher Watts was no longer just speaking to police. He was speaking to the entire world. Standing outside his home at 2825 Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado, Chris Watts gave a televised interview to Denver 7 News. And in that moment, millions of people watched him try to explain his missing family. He described Shanann as a loving mother. He asked for her and the girls to come home, and he claimed he had no idea where they could be. But something about the way he spoke didn't sit right with viewers. There was no panic in his voice, no visible breakdown, and at times, even a faint smile. Almost as if he was holding back something far bigger than grief. Within hours of the interview airing, social media exploded. Viewers began analyzing his body language frame by frame. Comments flooded in questioning whether Chris Watts was truly a worried husband, or something else entirely. And while the public was beginning to turn inside the investigation, detectives were already tightening their focus on him. Because earlier that day, they had begun collecting surveillance footage from neighbors. And inconsistencies in Chris Watts' statements were starting to pile up. He said one thing to police, another thing to friends, and something completely different to investigators behind closed doors. The story was no longer stable. It was collapsing in real time. And by the following day, Christopher Watts would agree to something that would change everything. A polygraph examination. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Because once Chris Watts agreed to that test, the case stopped being about a missing family and started becoming something far darker. By August 15, 2018, the investigation into the Watts family disappearance had reached a critical turning point. What began as a missing persons case in Frederick, Colorado, was now a focused criminal investigation centered on one man, Christopher Watts. That morning, investigators from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI brought Chris in for questioning. The setting was controlled, quiet, clinical. But what was happening inside that room was anything but calm. Detectives told Chris Watts they needed him to take a polygraph test. He agreed. And as the test began, every heartbeat, every pause, Every hesitation was being measured. When it ended, the results were clear. Chris Watts failed. And everything changed. Detectives now knew they were no longer dealing with uncertainty. They were dealing with deception. The atmosphere in the interrogation room shifted immediately. Questions became sharper. The pressure increased. And for the first time, cracks began to show in Chris Watts' carefully controlled story. He started adjusting details, changing timelines, contradicting earlier statements, trying to keep up with his own narrative. But the more he spoke, the less believable he became. Outside that room, investigators were already gathering new evidence. Cell phone data, surveillance footage, work records, financial history, and all of it was pointing in the same direction. Back to 2825 Saratoga Trail. As the questioning continued, Chris Watts was slowly cornered by his own inconsistencies. Until finally, the story he had been protecting for days began to collapse. And what came next would shock even the detectives who had spent years investigating violent crimes. Because Christopher Watts was about to confess. And in the next moment, the truth inside that interrogation room would begin to come out. After hours of pressure inside the interrogation room in Weld County, Colorado, something inside Christopher Watts finally broke. Not suddenly, not cleanly, but piece by piece. The man who had insisted he didn't know where his family was now struggling to maintain even the simplest version of his story. Detectives began pushing harder. They told him they already knew more than he was saying. And slowly, Chris Watts began changing his account. First, he suggested there had been a confrontation inside the home at 2825 Saratoga Trail. Then, he implied that something had happened in a moment of rage. And as the questioning intensified, his narrative shifted again. But what investigators were hearing was not a clear confession. It was fragments, contradictions, and attempts to place blame elsewhere. At one point, Chris Watts claimed Shanann had been responsible for the children's deaths. But even as he said it, his explanation failed to hold under scrutiny. Detectives didn't believe him. And they kept pressing. Because every inconsistency, every pause, every change in his story was tightening the noose around him. Eventually, Chris Watts reached a breaking point. And what followed was not the full truth, but the beginning of it. He admitted that Shanann Watts was no longer alive. He admitted that something had happened inside the home. And he admitted that the situation was far more serious than he had first claimed. But even then, he was not telling the complete story. Because the most horrifying details were still hidden. And investigators knew it. Outside the interrogation room, search teams were now preparing to move toward oil sites connected to Chris Watts' work at Anadarko Petroleum, a location known as Cervi 319 in Weld County, Colorado. A place that would soon become central to the case. And as Chris Watts sat in that room, still trying to control the truth, authorities were already closing in on the final piece of the puzzle. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Because what investigators would discover at Cervi 319 would change this case forever. While Christopher Watts remained inside an interrogation room in Weld County, Colorado, investigators were already moving toward a remote location tied directly to his work. A place most people would never visit unless they worked there. Cervi 319. An Anadarko Petroleum oil site located in Weld County, miles of open land, scattered equipment, and large storage tanks sitting in isolation under the Colorado sky. On August 16, 2018, search teams arrived at the site with a grim objective: to search for any sign of Shanann Watts and her two daughters, Bella and Celeste. What they found would turn a missing persons case into one of the most disturbing investigations in recent memory. Shanann Watts was located in a shallow grave on the property. The discovery confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect from the very beginning. This was no longer a disappearance. It was a homicide investigation. But the search was not over. Because Bella and Celeste were still missing. Teams expanded their search across the oil site, moving carefully between tanks and industrial equipment. Then, inside two separate crude oil storage tanks, they made the second discovery: the bodies of Bella and Celeste Watts. Two small children, hidden in a place designed to hold industrial waste and oil production materials. The scene stunned even experienced investigators. There were no easy words for what they were seeing. Back at the interrogation room, Christopher Watts was still speaking with detectives. He had not yet been told what investigators had found. But that would soon change. Because once confronted with the discoveries at Cervi 319, Chris Watts' story would collapse completely. And the final version of the truth would begin to emerge. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Because what Chris Watts said next would leave investigators with even more questions than answers. After the discoveries at Cervi 319 in Weld County, Colorado, everything changed. But Christopher Watts was still sitting inside the interrogation room, unaware that investigators now had the evidence to dismantle every version of his story. When detectives returned, the atmosphere was different. He was no longer being questioned about a missing family. He was being confronted with the truth. One by one, investigators revealed what had been found at the oil site. Shanann Watts had been recovered. Bella and Celeste were found in separate oil tanks. For a moment, Chris Watts said nothing. No explanation. No denial. Just silence. And then, the final collapse began. The carefully constructed stories he had given, the shifting timelines, the blame placed elsewhere. None of it could survive what investigators were showing him. Detectives pressed him again. And this time, Chris Watts stopped resisting in the same way. He began to speak more openly. He admitted that Shanann Watts had died inside the home at 2825 Saratoga Trail. He admitted he had transported the bodies to Cervi 319 in Weld County. And he admitted that the story he had originally told was not the truth. But even in this moment, the full reality of what happened still remained fragmented. Because Chris Watts was not giving a complete confession. He was giving pieces of it. Carefully. Slowly. Inconsistent even now. Detectives later described his behavior as controlled, detached, and at times emotionally flat. As if he was describing something that happened to someone else. Eventually, the interrogation reached its breaking point. And Chris Watts was formally taken into custody. The man who had once appeared on television pleading for his family's return was now at the center of a triple homicide investigation. Because even after everything Chris Watts admitted, investigators would later uncover contradictions that still raise questions about his final version of events. By November 2018, the Watts case had moved out of interrogation rooms and crime scenes and into a courtroom in Weld County, Colorado. The world was now watching what would happen to Christopher Watts. On November 6, 2018, prosecutors officially announced a plea agreement. Chris Watts would avoid the death penalty. In exchange, he would plead guilty to multiple counts of murder. The charges included the murders of Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, and Celeste Watts, as well as the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy with baby Nico. On November 19, 2018, Christopher Watts appeared in court for sentencing. Shackled, silent, expressionless. Inside the courtroom in Greeley, Colorado, families of the victims gave emotional statements. They described loss, devastation, and a life permanently changed. The courtroom was heavy with grief. And then, the judge delivered the sentence. 3 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for related charges. Christopher Watts would never walk free again. But even as the legal chapter closed, the public fascination with the case only grew stronger. Because people were still asking the same question. Why? Why would a husband, a father, a man who appeared so ordinary, commit something so unimaginable? And as the years passed, Christopher Watts remained in prison at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, where reports later emerged of prison letters, religious claims, and continued attempts to explain himself. Some said he had changed. Others said he was rewriting his story once again. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Because even after sentencing, the Watts case was far from finished in the public mind. And the deeper the internet went, the more disturbing the questions became. After the sentencing in November 2018, most criminal cases fade into history. The courtroom empties, the files are closed, and life moves on. But the Chris Watts case did something different. It didn't end. It moved online. Inside prisons like Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, Christopher Watts began communicating through letters. Some of those letters claimed remorse. Others described religious transformation. And in some accounts, he spoke as if he had become a different man entirely. But outside those prison walls, the internet began dissecting every detail of the case. Reddit threads grew into thousands of comments. YouTube channels broke down interrogation footage frame by frame. Body language experts analyzed his every blink, pause, and expression. And new theories began circulating. Some focused on inconsistencies in his confessions. Others questioned emotional behavior during interviews. And many debated whether everything investigators were told matched the full reality of what happened inside 2825 Saratoga Trail. Meanwhile, Shanann Watts' family continued to face a different kind of pain. Not just grief, but public attention, speculation, and online theories that kept the case alive in ways they never asked for. What had once been a private tragedy had become a global obsession. And as the years passed, documentaries and new analyses brought the case back into the spotlight again and again. Each time, new audiences discovered it. And each time, the same question returned. How could someone like Christopher Watts do this? Because even years later, the Watts case continues to divide opinions, fuel debates, and pull people deeper into the story that still refuses to fade. Long after the sentencing, long after the interrogation tapes, and long after the courtroom doors closed, the Watts case continued to leave behind something that never fully healed. Pain. For the family of Shanann Watts, life became a permanent before and after moment in time. Her parents and relatives were left not only with grief, but with the public nature of that grief. Every detail of the case had already been discussed online. Every photo, every message, every moment of her final days, analyzed by strangers around the world. And that created a second layer of suffering. One that didn't exist in the courtroom, but existed everywhere online. Meanwhile, the Watts home at 2825 Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado, stood as a silent reminder of what happened there. A place that once appeared ordinary, but became one of the most infamous houses in modern true crime history. Inside the broader public conversation, something else began to form. A shift. People were no longer just asking what happened. They were asking why this case still had such a hold on them. Why the interviews were still analyzed. Why the confessions were still debated. Why the story still resurfaced years later in documentaries, podcasts, and online discussions. And as more content emerged, so did more interpretations. Some focused on psychology. Some focused on deception. Some focused on behavior patterns and contradictions. But no single explanation ever fully satisfied the public. Because at the center of it all was a simple and disturbing reality. A family that looked normal. A husband who looked ordinary. And a truth that never felt fully understandable. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Because in the end, the Watts case didn't just become a crime story. It became a question people still can't stop asking. And that question is exactly why it will never be forgotten. Even years after the courtroom sentencing, one question continued to echo louder than all the others. What really happened inside the Watts home on Saratoga Trail? Because while Christopher Watts gave multiple versions of his confession, none of them ever felt complete. Investigators documented a shifting narrative in the days following his arrest. A story that changed under pressure. A story that moved between blame, denial, partial admission, and final acceptance. But even the final account left gaps that the public still discusses today. At 2825 Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado, the timeline of August 13, 2018, remains one of the most heavily analyzed sequences in modern true crime history. From Shanann's arrival home in the early hours, to the disappearance reported that morning, to the discovery of inconsistencies inside the house. Every moment has been replayed, slowed down, and reinterpreted by investigators, journalists, and millions of viewers online. And yet, No version of events has ever fully satisfied public curiosity, because the case is not just about what was discovered. It is about what was believed, and how quickly appearances can collapse under scrutiny. Christopher Watts, a man who once appeared calm, ordinary, and unremarkable, is now permanently associated with one of the most disturbing family cases in American history. And even though the legal process is over, the conversation around the case never truly ended. Because the final question is not just what happened. It's why this case still feels unfinished in the minds of so many people watching it years later. Christopher Watts is in prison. The case is closed. The confessions were made. And the world was told what happened inside that house on Saratoga Trail. But even now, one question refuses to go away. Was everything really explained? Or did Christopher Watts only ever tell the version of the story he wanted people to believe? Because when you look at the contradictions, the shifting confessions, and the moments investigators say didn't fully add up, you start to wonder if the full truth was ever truly spoken out loud. And maybe the most disturbing part of this entire case is not just what happened, but what we may still not fully understand. So I'll leave you with this. If you were sitting in that interrogation room, listening to Chris Watts change his story over and over again, would you believe you had the full truth? Or would you still feel like something was missing? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this investigation, make sure you subscribe to Midnight Evidence for more deep true crime breakdowns, interrogation analysis, and real case documentaries. Because some stories don't end when the case is closed. They end when the truth finally makes sense.